We're still talking about that period from 1820 to the 1840s when there started to be an emphasis on individualism. There started to be an emphasis on being a rugged, self-sufficient individualist. And as we discussed, in large part, that was a reaction against the feelings of anonymity and powerlessness that came about as a result of the changes of the Industrial Revolution and the Market Revolution. But now part of this emphasis on the self, which was exemplified in transcendentalism, right? The truth can be found in yourself. Part of this came to the idea of the mastery of oneself and really to the idea of ownership of one's self. That you, whether you had property or money or not, that you made the decisions about your own destiny and that your fate was in your own hands. Now, this movement led to more and more complaints about the property requirements to vote or to hold office that all the colonies had, and that when they became states had continued, except Pennsylvania in 1776 had been the first state to do away with that. Over the course of the 18 teens and especially into the 1820s, more and more states did in fact do away with their property requirements to be able to vote or hold office. And this was a huge change, and it was coming about more than 40 years, 40, almost 50 years since the Declaration of Independence. By 1828, there were only 3 states that still had property requirements to vote, and those were Virginia and North Carolina and Rhode Island. Now, Rhode Island's was especially strict. In fact, the state of Rhode Island continued using the 1663 charter for the colony, which had stated that only landowners could vote. By 1840, legislation had been passed that specified that you had to own land worth at least $134 to vote. Now, $134 in 1840, the average monthly wage was probably around $25, $30. So this is land worth 6 months' wages. So that's no small thing, really. And this meant that not only could people with really, really small land parcels not vote, people who were renting couldn't vote, but by this time period, the Industrial Revolution had been underway in Rhode Island for 50 years. Remember, the very first factory had been built in Rhode Island around 1790, and more people from the state, more and more men, had moved from the farm to the cities to work in factories. So, of course, they don't own land. 60% of white men in Rhode Island were unable to vote as of 1840 by law. The majority of white men couldn't even vote. Now, a lot of Rhode Islanders believe this to be unconstitutional, so far as having the right to vote, and it certainly was no longer the norm because most states had changed this. So, a guy named Thomas Dorr led a movement, a populist movement, the People's Movement, to set up a new state constitution and elect a new state government. And the people participating in this were all those people who didn't have the right to vote in Rhode Island. So, the power was concentrated. The majority of the power was concentrated in the elites of the state. So they got together to form to take a people's referendum that called for, among other things, universal suffrage. Now, suffrage means being allowed, in this case, being allowed to vote. Universal suffrage to all white males with 1 year's residency in the state. Now, Dorr had wanted to also extend the voting rights to all black males in the state, but the people, the populace, his followers, were not in favor of that. So that was not put in there, and so under this new constitution, black people wouldn't be able to vote. So when the official election was held, Samuel Ward King was elected, but this ad hoc election led to Thomas Dorr being elected as the people's governor. So you got two people claiming to be governor. Only one of them elected by state laws. The others elected by a larger majority of the other one elected by a larger majority of the people. But that didn't really help. Samuel Ward King appealed to the federal government to come in and help suppress this rebellion. And it was a rebellion to an extent. There wasn't a whole lot of fighting, but there almost was. The followers of Dorr had a cannon, and they tried to shoot it at the forces that came to stop them, but it misfired and accidentally killed a bystander, and that was the only casualty. So it all ended with Dorr being arrested, he and 5 of his lieutenants arrested and sent to prison. Now, he didn't stay in prison. He was in prison for a year or 2, and he and the others were pardoned once things calmed down. But the state government recognized they had a serious problem because all these angry white people that were a majority in the state were this angry enough to even take up arms, notwithstanding the fact the arms didn't work. So the official state government drew up a new state constitution that removed all property requirements for all free men, and that included African American citizens who were free as well as free white men. So this was probably the strictest of the property requirements. This is gone. Virginia followed suit. North Carolina finally did the following decade, 1856. And at that time then, there were no states with property requirements. But simply the fact that almost all states had no property requirements as of 1828 was going to make a very big difference in the presidential election of that year. But before we get to that, let's talk about this guy, a Frenchman named Alexis de Tocqueville, who was in the United States in the 1830s, actually there working for the French government, taking a tour of American prisons to see whether or not the American style of what were called penitentiaries, that was a new thing, might fly in France. But as a result of traveling around the country, visiting the different penitentiaries, he observed a lot of the activities of the average American, and he wrote a book about it called Democracy in America, published in 1835, primarily for a European audience. This is very similar to the book by that other Frenchman, Hector Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur, way back in the 1780s, 50 years before this, who had written a book, Letters from an American Farmer, describing America and Americans to Europeans. So that's what de Tocqueville is doing. And he's describing democracy with a small d, which was becoming a very popular word in the United States. It had not been a popular word in the 1780s because democracy with a small d was looked down on by most of the founding fathers as representing rule by the mob. You know, many of the founding fathers much preferred that only, people with a certain amount of land, status, and money be allowed to run things, because you can't trust the rabble, because they don't know what they're doing, and they're very emotional and easily swept away. George Washington, remember, had nasty things to say about Democrats with a small d. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson was smeared by the Federalists by calling him a Democrat. But now, with working class people, working class white men, getting the vote and starting to think about their own rights, then democracy, as in the will of the people in general, was becoming more widely accepted. So, de Tocqueville, in his description of Americans, talked about how democracy had become such a necessary part of American freedom. And here's some things that he said. He said, what is most important for democracy is not that great fortunes should not exist, but that great fortunes should not remain in the same hands. In that way, there are rich men, but they do not form a class. So in other words, what he was discovering, traveling among these Americans, is they didn't really mind if somebody got rich. In fact, they were all for it. But they did mind if someone got rich and that money stayed in their family, generation after generation, making them a sort of aristocracy like had existed in Europe and still did exist in Europe. Tocqueville also noted that while Europeans didn't care that much about money, they were more concerned about status and their social class. And as we've said several times, in Europe, it was very difficult to transcend your social class. Whatever class you were born in is most likely the class you're going to die in. But Tocqueville noticed that every American he met, it seemed, whether they were well-to-do, whether they were middle class, whether it was the stable boy cleaning up after the horses, or the waitress, or the waiter rather, in the tavern, they all expected that they were going to make money and get rich and rise up in life. That they expected they were going to have social mobility. As someone else later said, that Americans are always a class of temporarily embarrassed millionaires. Everyone hopes to become a millionaire and thinks maybe they can, and so they try to get there. If not a millionaire, then at least better off than they were. He also noticed that in America, unlike in Europe, you can't necessarily look at someone and tell what social class they are. Now, in England or in France, people of the upper classes dressed a certain way, and people of the lower classes did not dress that way, and it would be a huge, huge social issue if they did. But in America, he found, rich people could often dress like slobs, and poor people could take all the money they had to buy really nice clothes so they looked like they had money. He also noticed that freedom of speech was heavily emphasized in America. Everyone was in favor of freedom of speech until someone said something they didn't like, at which point they tried to suppress it. That's one of several of the things we've already talked about that perhaps you'll recognize as still being true. Well, we'll talk more about Tocqueville again in a couple of lectures under different contexts. But for now, let's take a look at this democracy that was flourishing. Democracy for all. Well, it wasn't democracy for all. It was an expanded democracy because now non-land-owning white men, age 21 and over, could vote. So that was the expansion of it, but nothing really new changed for women. Women couldn't vote. Women still had very few rights. Non-white people, especially African Americans, had very few rights, and in fact, as time passed, they had fewer. Now remember, when the country was formed, the original 13 states, 10 of those 13 states guaranteed the right to vote to free black men. The only 3 that didn't were Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia, which means North Carolina allowed free black men to vote in 1776. However, by about the turn of the century, some southern states, and northern states as well, started turning back the clock. Kentucky, which had become a state in 1792, 7 years later, rescinded the right for free black people to vote there. Maryland did so a couple of years later in 1801. And every new state that entered the Union after 1800, except for Maine, which became a state in 1820 and was in New England, used to be part of Massachusetts, every other new state restricted the vote to white men only. And in fact, as this is happening, new states don't let black people vote. Old states that previously had let black people vote start changing it. By 1860, free black men could only vote on the same basis as if they were white, only in 5 states. And those were all the states of New England. The other places, so we're talking about Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, black men could no longer vote when once they had been able to. Now, white immigrants that were coming in could vote. By the way, Rhode Island, one thing that they held on to when they changed their constitution was property requirements only for immigrants. But that didn't last. And it didn't apply in other states outside Rhode Island. So, if you were white and you were immigrating from England or France or Germany, Prussia at that time, then the moment you became a citizen, you could vote. Even if you were from Ireland and you were Catholic and people were really, really, really looking down on you, you could vote. But a free black man could not. Now, what that means is that whereas even as late as the 1700s, the biggest differentiation between people, the biggest marker of identity was class. You got the upper class people, you got the middle class, you got the lower class. And the lower class are often all in the same boat. White indentured servants, not very much better off than slaves. White male farm laborers or factory workers didn't have the right to vote any more than African Americans did. But by the 1840s, sooner than that, by this period we're talking about the 19th century in general, it was race that mattered, not class. Well, speaking of race, let's look in at a particular phenomenon that really took hold during this period, starting in the 1820s, that would become profoundly influential in American culture, known as the Minstrel Show. Minstrel shows were traveling entertainment that operated throughout the states of the United States, including in the North. In fact, they may have been as popular in the North as they were in the South, maybe even more so. And these minstrel shows had actors, almost always white actors in blackface, pretending to be black people, singing and dancing and acting out comedy skits. Here's an ad from 1843 for the celebrated Negro Melodies, Virginia Minstrels. These were extraordinarily popular. Now, the way that it worked is that the white performers in blackface, and they used burnt cork to blacken their face, would speak and sing in these exaggerated black accents. A lot of times these were northern white people performing these skits who may have never met a black person, but they knew how black people talk, or at least they thought they did, because this was the stereotype even then. And not only did they have the exaggerated speech patterns, they had the exaggerated actions. So the singing and dancing made it look as though black people were extraordinarily happy all the time. And the comedy skits were often centered on the ideas that black people are dumb, and that they are cowardly, and that they are lazy, and that they are immoral. And man, the audiences loved it. Now, this era produced early on in 1828 a song that was played frequently at minstrel shows called Jump Jim Crow by Thomas Rice. And later on, as you probably know, the segregation era that started in the 1890s and lasted until the 1960s was known as the Jim Crow era. This is where the term Jim Crow comes from, this exaggerated stereotype of black people. Now, this type of representation of black people was, why was it so popular? Well, it kind of eased the consciences of white people who might, somewhere in the back of their mind, they might be thinking maybe slavery is not a good thing. Maybe it is exceptionally cruel what happens to these poor people. But wait a minute, they're singing and dancing and they're just happy all the time, so it must not be that bad. And so there could be this degree of satisfaction even. Now, this type of minstrelsy lasted for a long time, even if it wasn't in blackface. Of course, it did last in blackface. All the way up until the 1960s, it was common to see blackface performers on television, on national television, and at the movies. But even when it wasn't white actors in blackface, even if it was black actors, frequently they were played up as the same kind of stereotypes from the minstrel shows, which is to say, dumb, lazy, immoral, and cowardly. Now, have you ever seen the Three Stooges? Most students, when I ask them that, have, yes, seen the Three Stooges. If you've watched more than a handful of Three Stooges shorts, you've seen an episode with a black person in it, because it happened from time to time. And when it does happen, think back on it, and if you don't remember, pay attention the next time you see it. The black people in the Three Stooges shorts are the only people dumber than the Three Stooges, and the only people more cowardly than the Three Stooges. Usually they're porters, or they are butlers, or they are cooks, and they're way more terrified of the ghosts or the crooks or whatever than Moe, Larry, and Curly and or Shemp were. And they're just presented as dumb. In fact, this whole idea was so deeply entrenched that, there are some things that are still cultural touchstones that carry echoes of it, like this. I bet you recognize this. It's from the movie Dumbo that came out in 1941. The scene where Dumbo got drunk and wakes up on top of a tree, which has always seemed kind of questionable to me anyway, but wakes up and hears these crows laughing at the idea that an elephant can fly. I done seen about everything when I seen an elephant fly. What you say? I say when I see an elephant fly. The exaggerated dialect and even their appearance indicates they're supposed to be African American. They got kind of a jazz motif to them. And notice that the one guy's wearing that broad-brimmed hat and that vest. That's part of what's known as a zoot suit, which was sort of like the equivalent of hip-hop apparel of the 1930s and 1940s. Young black men and young Latino men dressed that way. So it was intended for everyone to realize these crows are Jim Crows. All right, now, another big impact on the culture was this guy, Stephen Foster, a songwriter, whose songs were written in the minstrel tradition and often were played at minstrel shows. Some of these songs you may have heard. Camptown races, Camptown ladies sing this song, doo-dah, or the sun shines bright on my old Kentucky home. Stephen Foster was only in the South once in his whole life. On his honeymoon, they went to New Orleans. That's the only time he was ever in the South. But these songs were all about Southern culture and frequently were from the point of view of black characters, black singers, especially the song Old Folks at Home. Now, you may not recognize that title, but you might recognize the song. So let's listen to part of it and notice something about it.
belonging for the old plantation and for the old folks at home. All the world and sad and dreary everywhere I roam. Oh, dark is how my heart grows weary, far from the old folks at home. Oh, round the little farm I wandered when I was young. Then many happy days I squandered, many the songs I sung. When I was playing with my brother, happy was I. Oh, take me to my kind old mother, yeah, let me live and die.
So this song is about an African American slave or former slave longing to go back to the plantation, to go back and be with his family, back on the plantation of his youth, because all the world is sad and dreary everywhere he roams. So he has roamed from the plantation, and that probably means he has escaped. He's escaped to the north and now regrets it and wishes that he could go back because life was so much better there and so much better then. Well, no wonder white audiences love this, right? Because it could make them feel better about themselves. And a lot of the audiences in the North had never actually seen slavery, so they didn't know firsthand how ugly it was, how bad it was. They only knew it through songs like this and through the performances of white actors in blackface at the minstrel shows. And like I said, this is a profound effect on American culture. This was the beginning. This was the beginning of the American practice of adopting African American culture and sort of co-opting it and taking it over and using it. And this would be repeated later with gospel music, with blues, with jazz, with rhythm and blues, with rock and roll, with rap, with hip hop. It is a long-standing tradition of at least a couple of hundred years, and it demonstrates a desire to be attached to this very soulful culture, but without having any kind of a deep understanding of it. And in fact, these expressions, these co-opted expressions of that culture expressed by white people, many of whom had never met a slave, was the basis that most people had for what they thought slavery was like. Happy-go-lucky. And this was indeed of profound influence, because we looked at how all the way up 100 years later it was still showing up in movies and TV shows. But it also shows up in the attitude that slavery wasn't really that bad. You hear white people say that sometimes. And I mean, sometimes it's people who are defending the Confederacy or the Old South. Sometimes it's not even people who are doing that. It's just average people in the United States. Now, in this class, if you're taking this class right now, you know that I assign things like the Kyle Baker graphic novel about Nat Turner's Rebellion, movies like 12 Years a Slave, and it is very, very common for me when I'm reading the papers students write about those works to express surprise at how bad slavery was. I mean, they'll frequently say, I knew it was bad, but it was never demonstrated to me how bad. And I think that can be traced back to this minstrelsy and other things as well that we will be looking at more closely soon.